He was one of the finest killers alive. 2 years on the Eastern Front. More men dead by his rifle than most soldiers I'll ever see. A professional, not a boy, a man who had watched soldiers die at 400 meters and felt nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved correctly. One July morning in 1944, in the hedgerows of Normandy, he settled in behind his scope and took his shot. It was a good shot. One American went down, and then, for the first time in his life, he did not understand what he was looking at. The men had been marked for death, did not lie down. They did not freeze. They did not do the one thing every enemy he had ever faced had always done. Within 3 seconds, they were all moving, and they were firing back with a speed that should not have been possible. And the hunter, the scope understood, with dirt kicking up beside his face, that he had somehow become the hunted. He was not the first German marksman to see it. He would not be the last. And in the weeks that followed, men like him filed reports up the chain of command that all circled the same strange, quiet fear. Something is wrong with the way the Americans move. If your father or your grandfather carried a rifle across Europe in those years, this is the story of what they had quietly become. Something the best trained snipers on Earth could see through their scopes and could not explain and could not stop. To understand it, you have to stand for a moment where that sniper stood. The hedgerows of Normandy do not look like a battlefield. That is the first thing you would notice, standing in one of those narrow lanes in July of 1944. You would see green, walls of it. Earthen banks older than any nation in the fight, packed hard by 1,000 years of farmers, and crowned with hawthorn and bramble, grown so thick that noon looked like dusk beneath them. The French had a word for this country, bocage. To the men who had to cross it, the word came to mean something closer to a coffin, with the lid left open. What follows is reconstructed honestly from the record on both sides. From the Doctrine, the German sniper program drilled into its men, and from the after-action bulletins, the American army printed and passed hand to hand. There is no single diary that says all of this in one voice. There is something better. There is what each army down about the other. Into that green, before the sun had cleared the tree line, a man had already made himself part of the landscape. He had been in position for hours. He had chosen the spot the night before, the way he had been taught, the way he had done 100 times in a country very far from this one. He lay behind the bank where the shadow was deepest, his rifle resting on a folded cloth, so the barrel would not catch the light. He had broken the outline of his shoulders with cut branches. He had waited long enough that the birds had forgotten him and started singing again. That was the sign. When the bird forgot you, so did everyone else. We do not know his name. That matters, and we will come back to why it matters. For now, understand only what he was. He was, by any measure that armies use to measure such things, one of the finest killers alive. Not a boy with a rifle, a professional. 2 years on the Eastern Front were folded into the stillness of his hands. He had learned his trade in the ruins and the wheat and the frozen mud of a war so vast it does not fit inside the imagination. He had watched men die at 400 meters and felt nothing but the small satisfaction of a problem solved correctly. This morning the problem walked into his lane just after first light. 12 of them. American infantry, moving up through the hedgerow country in a loose file, rifles slung or carried low, helmets dark against the pale morning. Young. He could tell they were young, even at this distance, in the way they moved, the loose confidence of men who had not yet been taught the specific lessons this ground was about to teach. He counted them without moving his lips. 12, he noted the spacing between them, the gaps, the rhythm of their boots. He was not simply looking at soldiers. He was reading them the way you read a sentence you have read before and already know how it ends. He picked the third man in the file, not the first. The first man, if he fell, would send the others diving for the ditch on the near side where he could not reach them. The third man, dropping, would freeze the ones behind and behind them. It was arithmetic. It was patience. It was everything he had been built to do. He let his breath go halfway out, held and held it there. He squeezed. The shot cracked across the field and rolled back off the far bank, and the third man folded the way men fold when the string is cut, all at once, without argument. One American on the ground, not moving. And here the morning was supposed to obey him. Here is what was supposed to happen. He had seen it so many times it had become the truth beneath his conscious mind, a thing he no longer had to think about. The others would drop. They would press themselves into the earth. There would be shouting, a voice climbing toward panic, a sergeant screaming at men to find cover they could not find. They would go still. And in that stillness, that long, generous, human stillness, he would work. He would take the second man. Then, when the ones who had gone to ground finally raised their heads to look for the shooter they could not see, he would take a third. He had all morning. They had just given it to him. That is what was supposed to happen. It did not happen. 2 seconds passed, maybe 3. And the file of Americans did not press itself into the earth and wait to die. It exploded. Not in panic. That was the thing his eye caught first, and his mind refused. There was no freeze, no huddle, no slow, terrible stillness for him to feed on. The formation came apart, motion, and the motion had a shape. Men ran, but not far, not blindly. They ran in short bursts, 2 steps, 3, and dropped, and while one pair ran, another pair was already firing, and while that pair ran, a third was up. It was not a rout, it was a machine. Cover and move. Move and cover. Each man buying seconds for the man beside him with the muzzle of his own rifle. And the rifles. He had spent his life inside the sound of battle. He knew the voice of every weapon on this continent the way a musician knows an orchestra. He knew the bolt-action rhythm in his bones, the crack, and then the pause, that small, honest pause, while a man worked the bolt, lifted, pulled, pushed, locked. The pause that was the sniper's whole world, because the pause was when you moved, when you breathed, when you lived. There was no pause. The fire came at him semi-automatic, round after round after round, with no gap to hide in, and it came from 3 directions at once, and it was too much. It was far too much. He was looking at 12 men. He was hearing 40. The volume of it did not match the arithmetic in front of his eyes, and for a soldier whose entire craft is the accurate reading of a battlefield, nothing is more disorienting than fire that lies about how many men are making it. He shifted his aim to the man he had marked as second. The man was not there. The man had already moved. He fired anyway, into the space where a soldier should have been by the logic he trusted, and he hit nothing but Normandy. He worked the bolt. In the time it took him to work it, 3 American rifles found the bank he was lying behind and chewed it, and dirt kicked up beside his face, and a branch he had cut and placed with such care spun away into the light. They had not seen him. He was certain of that. They had not found him. They were simply putting fire everywhere a man like him might be, saturating the tree line with lead as they came. And they were coming, not stopping, not hesitating, closing the distance while they fired. And a sniper's whole existence depends on the enemy stopping. These men would not stop. He fired a third time. He missed a third time. And sissed somewhere in the cold professional part of him that had kept him alive through 2 years of a war that killed better men than him every single day. A single, clear thought arrived, and it was not a thought he had ever needed before. He was no longer the hunter. He had known it for 3 seconds now, and the knowledge was still impossible. He pulled back off the bank, low, dragging his rifle, moving with the discipline that had been drilled into him until it was cheaper than fear. He got clear. He survived that morning. Not all of the men who lay in the hedgerows that summer did. That evening, and in the weeks after, men like him tried to put words to what they had seen. And they could not quite manage it. It was the speed of it, the refusal of it. The way they poured fire while running, matching no enemy these men had ever been prepared to face. The fear in those reports, if you read them closely, was the fear of a professional who has met a problem his training has no answer for. To understand what he was looking at, you have to understand what he was. And to understand what he was, you have to leave Normandy entirely and go a very long way east. Because here is the truth that the green lanes of France concealed. By the summer of 1944, the German sniper was, in the flat judgment of the historians who study these things, the finest in the world. Not because of the rifle, though the Karabiner 98K with its telescopic sight was a beautiful and deadly instrument. Not because of talent, though the men the program produced worked at a level that reads, from a distance, like something out of legend. Matthias Setzenauer, credited with 345 kills. Josef Allerberger, credited with 257. Fieldcraft so complete approached the supernatural, patience so total, it stopped being besieged and became a kind of stillness most people never touch in their lives. The German program was the finest in the world for one reason above all. It had been enforced in the worst classroom in the history of war. For 3 years before a single American set foot on a Normandy beach, Germans had been fighting and dying on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union in a duel of precision killing that consumed marksmen by the thousand and refined the survivors into something terrible. The Soviets had shocked them from the first weeks, fielding snipers of their own who became myths in their own right, men and women both. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a Soviet sniper credited with 309 kills, a woman whose name the Germans learned to fear. That pressure, that relentless bloody arms race in the art of the single shot, is what built the German sniper of 1944. And that is the trap. That is the whole tragedy of the man behind the bank, hidden in it like a splinter under the skin. Because everything he knew, every reflex burned below conscious thought, every intuition about how a hitman's comrades would react, how long they would stay down, where they would look, and when, all of it had been calibrated against one specific enemy, a Soviet soldier. He was a world expert in the behavior of an army that was not on this field. He had spent years learning to predict the movements of men who moved a certain way, broke a certain way, died in certain readable shapes, and he had learned it so well that the knowledge was no longer knowledge. It was instinct. It was truth. And in July of 1944, that truth walked into a hedgerow in France, wearing an American uniform, and it did not break the way it was supposed to break. And the finest sniper in the world discovered, with dirt kicking upside his face, that his greatest strength had become the one thing he could not see past. He had trained for the wrong war. The question is how the other men, the Americans, the loose and confident and frighteningly young men in the file, came to move the way they did. Because they had not always moved like that. A year and a half earlier, in the mountains of another country, an American force had met the Germans and had done exactly what the sniper expected. They had frozen. They had died in the open, waiting, the way men are supposed to. Something happened in between. Something that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with how an army learns. To find the moment everything changed, you have to leave the hedgerows of France behind and travel a year and a half back in time to a place most Americans have never heard of and never will. A dry, wind-scored gap in the mountains of Tunisia, a pass called Kasserine, kept February of 1943. The American army that had come north from Africa was young in a way that is hard to describe to anyone who has not seen it. Not young in years, young in blood. It had never truly been hurt. It had numbers, and behind those numbers stood a continent of factories, oceans of and fuel, and canned food and ammunition, the Chinese machine of production, the likes of which the world had never built. But it had not yet learned the one lesson that no factory can stamp out and ship overseas. It had not learned what happens to men when the fighting is real and the enemy is good. And the men on the other side of that valley were very, very good. They had been at war for years. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, a name that carried weight even in the mouths of the men he was trying to kill, sent his veterans through that pass, and what happened next was not a battle so much as a lesson delivered with a hammer. Americans came apart. Units that looked clean and confident on a headquarters map advanced into open desert in formations that belonged on a parade ground back in Georgia. And the German gunners, patient men who had done this 100 times, let them come and then took them apart at their leisure. Tanks rolled forward, without scouts ahead of them, straight into prepared killing grounds, and were burning within minutes. Orders came down from officers who had never once walked the ground they were sending men to die on. The line broke, then it ran. In a matter of days, the United States Army lost thousands of men, killed and wounded, and marched off into captivity. It lost close to 200 tanks, along with guns and trucks, burning wreckage of them scattered across the desert floor. And it lost something that does not appear on any casualty report. It lost its confidence. It fell back through those mountains in a rout, beaten, humiliated, and the news of it traveled all the way home to kitchens and front frontage across America, where mothers and fathers read that their boys had been thrashed in their first real fight. Now here is the part that reaches all the way forward to that sniper in the hedgerow, the part never have known as he lay behind his earthen bank in Normandy. At Kasserine, the American soldier behaved exactly the way German doctrine said he would. He panicked when the shooting started. He went to ground, and he waited. When men began to fall, the survivors did the most natural, most human thing there is. They pressed themselves flat into the earth and were at least praying for the storm to pass over them. And precisely that, was the behavior that German sniper machine gunners and infantry veterans had spent years learning to feast on. A man who goes to ground and holds still is a man who has just handed his enemy the one thing that enemy needs most: time. Give a professional killer time, and he will use every second of it, and he will use it on you. So, the German assessment of the American soldier, written down in the weeks after Kasserine, was not arrogance. It was not contempt for its own sake. It was, in the flat and careful language that intelligence officers use, an honest reading of exactly what they had seen. The Americans, the reports said, were brave enough. No one questioned their courage. But they were amateurs. Rich in material, poor in doctrine. Deadly behind a curtain of artillery. Deadly in a factory. But in the close and personal and terrible business of infantry combat, they would fall back on the same Saturns that had just gotten them slaughtered in the desert. They would freeze. They would wait. They would die where they lay. And every word of that was true. In February of 1943, it was completely, verifiably true. The catastrophe for the German army, the mistake that would eventually cost them more than they had the ability to count, was that they wrote it down as though it would be true forever. Because here is the thing that sits at the very center of this entire story, and it is worth stopping on, because it explains everything that came after. Every army in that war had its Kasserine, every single one. The British had been driven into the sea at Dunkirk, forced to abandon a continent and swim for home. The Soviets had lost whole armies in the first weeks of the German invasion, hundreds of thousands of men swallowed up in a single summer of disaster. And the Germans themselves, these very professionals, would soon freeze and starve and surrender by the tens of thousands in the frozen ruins of a Russians called Stalingrad. Catastrophe was not the exception in that war. Catastrophe was the weather. What separated the armies that lived from the armies that were destroyed was never whether they failed. They all failed. It was what they did with the failure after it happened. And the American army, green and beaten and freshly humiliated in the mountains of Tunisia, did something spectacular that, when you look at it squarely, is one of the most quietly extraordinary things any institution did in the whole of the Second World War. It refused to be ashamed of it. It treated the disaster as information, not as a wound to be hidden, not as bad luck to be shrugged off, not as something to blame on the weather or the terrain or the fortunes of war. The Americans looked at Kasserine the way an engineer looks at a bridge lying in the river. They did not weep over it, and they did not lie about it. They asked one cold question: what broke? And then they went and fixed it with a ruthlessness that the proud men across the wire never saw coming. They fired the men who had failed. There was a general named Lloyd Fredendall who had commanded the American Corps at Kasserine. He had run the battle from a vast underground bunker complex, blasted out of a hillside far behind the front, a headquarters so distant from the fighting that he almost never saw it with his own eyes. Within weeks of the defeat, Fredendall was relieved of his command and sent home. And the man they put in his place was a hard, profane, pistol-wearing cavalry officer named George Patton. A man who believed that a commander's place was forward, with his men, where the dying was done. That is what accountability looked like. You failed, you were gone, and in your chair, they put a man who understood why you had failed. But firing the generals was the smallest part of it. They rewrote the manuals, and not the grand books of strategy that generals argue over in distant palaces. They went all the way down to the smallest and most human level of war, the level where a sergeant and his 12 men live and die, the level of a single boot on a single patch of dirt. They rewrote the instructions that tell an ordinary soldier exactly what to do in the 3 seconds after the first bullet cracks past his ear. And then they did the thing that system, for all its genius, was slowly losing the ability to do. They shared it, fast. With honestly, there was a bulletin, the 1st United States Army put it together, and others like it moved through the force, and it was called, with no drama and no poetry whatsoever, Combat Lessons. It gathered up the after-action reports from every unit that had touched the enemy, every squad that had walked into an ambush, every platoon that had lost good men to hidden, on every hard and bloody mistakes. All of it was studied and boiled down into plain, specific, usable words. Not inspiration, not speeches, just this. Here is what killed you last time. Here is what to do instead. And one lesson came up in those pages again and again and again. Edition after edition, unit after unit. From the fountains of Sicily, through the freezing mud of Italy, and on into the hedgerows of France. It appeared so many times for one simple reason. It had been paid for so many times, in the same currency, by different men who had not been told, or had been told, and had not believed. Never, under any circumstances, go to ground and lie still when a sniper opens fire. The report that hammered it home told a small story, in the blunt voice of a man who had watched something he could not forgive. A squad was crossing open ground. A single German sniper fired one round and hit one man. The squad went to ground. The sniper fired again. A second man dropped. The squad stayed dead down, and the sniper, hidden somewhere in cover they could not find, but patient as death itself, simply went to work. One man at a time. He had the whole afternoon. They had given it to him. The lesson written underneath that story is not a heroic one. It does not feel brave. It feels to every nerve in the human body like madness. When a man is shooting at you, every instinct you own screams a single word. Down, get small, do not move. Press yourself into the earth and disappear. Lying in the dirt feels like safety. Standing up and walking toward the place the bullets are coming from feels like throwing your life away. But the arithmetic of it is simple, and it is merciless. A man lying still in the open in front of a trained sniper is already a dead man. He just has not been told yet. He is a target that has agreed not to move while the killer takes his time. But a man who is up, moving, changing direction, firing back, is a problem the sniper's manual does not have a clean answer for. And 12 men, all up at once, all moving, all firing, covering one another in pairs, are not a target at all anymore. They are a wave, and you do not stop a wave with one rifle. So the Doctrine, purchased in blood and printed on cheap paper, said the thing that felt insane and was true. Do not lie down. Move. Move forward, into the fire, toward the gun. Fire at the place the shooter probably is, then. Move again. Give the man behind the scope nothing to hold still and kill. They even built it into the rhythm of a man's own body, so he would not have to think about it when thinking became impossible. They taught a soldier that when he broke from cover, he should be up and moving for no longer than it took to say 5 words to himself. I'm up. He sees me. I'm down. 3 seconds, maybe 5. Because 3 to 5 seconds is roughly how long it takes for an enemy to spot a running man, swings his weapon, aim, and fire. Stay up longer than that, and you have given him his shot. Stay up less, and you are gone before he can take it. Up. He sees me. Down. A little prayer of survival, said, with the feet. The Americans learned it, slowly, painfully. Across a year and a half, from North Africa to Sicily to Italy, over the bodies of the men who learned it the hard way so the next man would not have to. And by Normandy, they had learned it so completely that it had stopped being words on a page and become the thing their bodies simply did. Without an order, without a thought, the instant the first shot cracked. That is what the German sniper was looking at, in the hedgerow, when the file of hen he had bet did not lie down and die, but detonated forward into motion instead. He was not looking at braver men. Bravery had nothing to do with it. He was looking at a year and a half of hard institutional learning, poured into the muscle and bone of 12 young men in a field in France. He was looking at Kasserine, answered. But a lesson is only ink on paper until a man holds the tool that lets him obey it. And here the whole story turns on a single piece, steel and walnut, 9.5 pounds of it, that one army alone in all the world had placed in the hands of every ordinary rifleman. Because you cannot move and fire and move again if your own rifle forces you to stop. The German behind that bank carried the Carabiner 98K. It was a magnificent weapon, accurate, rugged, trusted by the men who carried it, but it was disbolt action. After every single shot, the rifleman had to lift his hand from the trigger, take the bolt, raise it, draw it back, drive it forward, lock it down, and only then could he fire again. In practiced hands, 2 seconds, maybe 3, and in those 2 or 3 seconds, the rifle owned the man completely. He could not move, he could not do anything at all but work the bolt, and every major infantry rifle in every major army in that war worked exactly the same way. The German, the British, the Soviet, the Japanese. Bolt action, everyone. Fire and stop, fire and stop. A rhythm of shots and silences, and the silences belonged to the sniper. Every army but one. The American carried the M1 Garand, and the Garand was semi-automatic. You pulled the trigger, and it fired, and the weapon cycled itself. Throughout the spent brass and chamber to the next round before your finger had even come back. And you pulled again, and it fired again. 8 rounds, as fast as a man could aim, with no pause, no bolt, no dead Brit, where the weapon lifted you out of the fight and set you down as a target. General Patton, a man who did not give away compliments, called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. He was not exaggerating, and he was not being sentimental. He was doing math. Understand what this weapon did to the sniper's entire world. His craft rested on a rhythm he could hear and count and hide inside. A squad of bolt-action rifles made a sound he knew in his sleep, a stutter of cracks and gaps, and in the gaps he lived, he moved, he worked. But a squad of 12 men with Garands made no gaps. The fire came continuous, a solid wall of it, 12 rifles firing 3 times faster than anything he had ever stood against. And a sniper trying to judge the strength of the force in front of him by the volume of its fire came up saying a number that was catastrophically, fatally wrong. There are accounts from the hedgerows of German positions held by experienced troops who heard the fire of an American attack coming and held their own counterattack back by waiting, certain that fresh reinforcements had to be coming up behind the first men, because no small unit on Earth could possibly make that much noise. And when at last they moved, they discovered they had been frozen in place, made cautious, made slow and useless by a single American platoon. The weapon did not merely kill men, it lied about how many men were doing the killing, and the Garand was the thing, the only thing, that let the new doctrine live. Move and fire and move. You cannot do that with a bolt-action rifle, because the bolt makes you stop, and stopsing is the thing that gets you buried. But a man with a Garand could walk forward, steady, and put a round into the hedgerow every 2 or 3 paces, without ever once breaking his stride, keeping the enemy's head pinned down, keeping himself moving, exactly as the bulletins had ordered for over a year. The lesson and the tool had finally found one another. Neither one alone would have been enough. The lesson without the rifle was a good idea that got men killed. The rifle without the lesson was just a faster way to shoot from the ground. Together, they broke the sniper's equation in half. But there was one more thing that Sniper lost in that green lane, and it was the deepest loss of all, because it cut straight into the reason a sniper exists. A sniper is not a man who kills at random. He is a man who chooses. That is his entire value, the thing that makes him worth more than an ordinary rifleman with a scope. He selects the one target whose death will hurt the enemy the most, and he removes it. He carries a hierarchy in his head, drilled in until it is holy. The officers is first. Kill the officer, and the unit heads its head, its mind, its plan. Severance, then, the sergeants, the non-commissioned officers, the men who actually run a squad in the screaming confusion of a firefight, then affixed the machine gunners, the radiomen, the men on the heavy weapons, etc. A sniper reads a formation the way a surgeon reads a body, hunting for the one place to cut that will stop the whole thing from working. For years, the SEAs against the Soviets, this had worked beautifully. The leaders were readable. You could see who gave the orders, who carried himself a certain way, who the other men turned toward when things went wrong. You found the head. You took it. The body died. The Americans took that away from him too. Because the American army had studied the snipers as carefully as the snipers had studied everything else. And it had figured out exactly what they were doing, and it had quietly rewritten the way its own men appeared on the battlefield. American officers near the front stopped wearing the bright rank insignia that had always marked them out. They stripped the shining bars off their collars and shoulders, because a shining bar in a hedgerow was a death warrant delivered by a man you would never see. Saluting near the front line was discouraged, and in some units, flatly forbidden, because a salute told a watchsniper in one clean gesture exactly which of two men was the officer, and exactly where to aim. Officers carried rifles and carbines instead of pistols. They dressed like their men, dug like their men, looked like their men, and the sergeants who squads Skeffer led from inside the formation, not out in front of it, so there was no lone figure at the point to mark and kill. So the sniper in the hedgerow, sweeping his scope slowly across those 12 moving men, hunting for the one whose death would matter, found something that must have felt like a kind of vertigo. He could not tell them apart. There was no officer out front with gleaming brass on his collar. There was no man being saluted, no man the others visibly deferred to, no head to cut. There were only 12 young men who all looked the same, all moved the same, all fired the same, and anyone he chose was as likely to be a 19-year-old on their first patrol as the man who led them. The hierarchy that had made him deadly against the Soviets had simply ceased to exist. The targets had erased the very thing he had been trained his whole life to find. And if you want to see all of this walking on two legs through the Normandy hedgerows, there was a man named Walter Ehlers. He was 23 years old, a staff sergeant, a squad leader in Company L of the 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the outfit the world would come to know as the Big Red One. He was a farmer's son from Junction City, Kansas, a quiet town in the middle of a quiet state, about as far from a French hedgerow as a young man could be born. He was not a legend, not then, not to himself. He was a man with a job, and the job was the lives of 12 other men. He had come ashore on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, into the worst morning of the war. And in his own telling, years later, in his own plain words, the thing he was proudest of from that day was not any German he killed. It was this. He got his entire squad off that beach, all 12 of them, up off the bloody sand and up the bluff, and he did not lose a single man doing it. On a morning when the surf ran red, when whole companies were cut to ribbons before they cleared the water, Walter Ehlers took his 12 men across the killing ground, and every one of them lived. He did not do it by being brave the way the movies mean brave. He did it by keeping them moving, by never once letting them stop, by doing, under the worst fire cry of his life, the exact thing those cheap paper bulletins had been preaching for over a year. When the enemy is trying to pin you down so the mortars can find you, the answer is never the ground. The answer is speed. Move. Cover your brother. Fire. Move again. In the days that followed, he led that squad off the beach and inland into the hedgerows, into the green coffin country where the sniper waited, And what he did there was not the wild, doomed heroism of a man who wanted to die. It was the doctrine carried out by a man who had taken it all the way into his bones. He kept his men moving. He put his own body where the fire was heaviest, so that the fire would come to him instead of to them. He did not go to ground and wait, not once. He is worth remembering. But not as a Superman, and he would have been the first and the loudest to tell you so. He is worth remembering as living proof in flesh and blood of a system that had learned its lesson and paid for it in full. Take Walter Ehlers and multiply him by the hundreds of thousands and spread him across the whole long front, and you have the thing the German sniper saw through his scope and could not put a name to. An army of ordinary men who would not lie down, who moved in pairs, covering one another so that there was never a still target to be had, who fired a continuous wall of sound that lied about their numbers, who had erased their own leaders from view so there was no head left to cut off. The sniper had spent his entire life about becoming an expert, and in the span of a single summer, every single thing that had made him an expert was turned one by one into a blind spot. He wrote it down, as best a man can write down a thing he does not understand. He passed it up the chain. Something is wrong with the way these men move, and his report began the long climb upward, a puzzled voice among many, towards a machine that could no longer turn a warning into a fare fast enough for it to matter. Because while the Germans were still struggling to describe the problem, the Americans, out there in the green, were already writing the next lesson. And the next one would be worse. By the end of July, the Hedgerows finally broke open. For 7 weeks, the fight had been a slow, bleeding crawl through that maze of earthen banks, field by field, hedge by hedge, a few hundred yards a day paid for with the bodies of men. And then, at the end of that month, the American army tore a hole in the German line and poured through it, and the war changed its shape overnight. The Green Coffin country gave way to open ground, to rolling French farmland and long roads running east. And onto those roads came a general who had been waiting his whole life for exactly this. George Patton had taken over the Third Army, and Patton did not believe in stopping. Out in that open country, the Doctrine in the Hedgerows came into its full and terrible flower. Patton pushed a tactic he called marching fire, and it was the principle of movement carried all the way to its limit. An attacking line of infantry did not stop and take cover and fire from the ground. It walked forward, straight at the enemy, and every man fired his weapon as he came, not carefully aimed, just steady and relentless, around into the positions every few paces, on and on without pause. The Garands made it possible. A whole line of men advancing and firing, and never stopping, pouring so much lead into the defenders that no one over there could lift his head long enough to aim back. It kept the enemy pinned. It kept the attackers moving, and more than anything, it did the thing that broke men on the other side. It did not hesitate. It just came. For a sniper, for any defender who had built his life on the enemy, stopping long enough to be killed, marching fire was a nightmare made real. There was no single target. There was no pause. There was only a wall of men and fire walking toward you across a field, and it did not slow down when you shot into it, and it did not go to ground, and it did not stop. And the German army, by August of 1944, was running out of the one thing it could not manufacture: men. The veterans, the professionals, the men who had learned their brutal trade on the Eastern Front were being killed and captured faster than any nation could ever replace them. And the replacements coming forward to fill those empty boots were younger and younger, and greener, and more frightened, less trained with every life. This is the part of the story that gets left out of the comfortable telling. Response to the strange, unstoppable Americans was not some brilliant new doctrine cooked up by clever men in a headquarters. There was no answer. There was only exhaustion. And out of that exhaustion came the boys. As the German lines were driven back, small groups of very young marksmen were sometimes left behind, hidden. Positioned in ground the Germans had already given up, told to stay concealed and fire on the Americans from the rear. after the front had rolled past them. Some of them were 16, some 17. Boys who had grown up as inside a machine that had been feeding them one idea since they were small children. Boys whose rifle training was often better than their sense of how to survive a battlefield. And here we have to be careful and honest, because the comfortable version of this story wants to make it something it was not. It is tempting to call this a clever countermove, a deliberate answer to the American way of war. It was not. There is no good evidence that a grand plan to defeat American movement with hidden boys. It was what happens to an army when the professionals are gone and the factories of men have started scraping the bottom. It was not adaptation. It was the last thing you do when you have run out of everything else. And it was in its own small way effective. Not because these boys killed in great numbers. Because of where and when they killed. A soldier who has advanced past a position, who believes the fighting has moved on ahead of him, who lets his shoulders down for 30 seconds to cut some branches for the roof of a foxhole, is a man in a different kind of danger than a man advancing under fire. There are accounts, most of them from the later fighting, as the war ground toward its end, of Americans shot through the face while doing exactly that. Cover, 100 yards behind what they thought was the front. Killed by a marksman who had been left behind and told to wait. The boys who did this almost never lived. That was the terrible arithmetic of it. Unlike a seasoned sniper who takes his shot and slips away to a second position prepared in advance, these children often stayed, whether from a lack of the experience that teaches a man when to run, or from something that had been put into their heads about not leaving their post. They held their ground and fired until the ammunition ran out. And by 1944, the Americans knew exactly what to do about a sniper. The lessons of that summer had gone all the way into the bone. A squad taking fire from a stay-sign sniper did not freeze and hand him time. It moved, it covered, it fired, it flanked, and it killed him almost every time. So think about what that actually was. On one side, an army that treated every death as a lesson, and pushed the lesson forward through the whole force in a matter of weeks. On the other, an army so drained that its answer to the problem was to leave its children on hilltops to die. Both of those things were happening in the same fields, in the same summer. And the boys were real, and their disruption was real, and their deaths were real, every one of them. Somebody's son, raised for this, spent on it. But dear is the Stia's turn in the whole story. The final one, it is the one, the sniper in the hedgerow. Our sniper from that first morning could never quite see because he was too close to it. He saw the change before almost anyone. That was the strange gift of his trade. His survival depended on predicting the enemy, and so he was the first to feel it when the enemy stopped being predictable. He was the early warning. The man whose whole life was reading patterns was first to notice, with dirt kicking up beside his face, that the pattern had broken. He wrote it down. Something is wrong with how these men move. He passed it up the chain, one honest, puzzled voice. But he could only see his own small square of the war. He could not see the whole. He could not see that what he was looking at was not a trick, not a new formation, not some clever order handed down from an American general. What he was looking at was an entire organization that had learned how to learn. He was seeing the output of a system that took its failures, studied them without shame, wrote down the answers, and pushed them out to every man in the field faster than the enemy could ever respond. That was the thing that beat him. Not a better soldier, not a wonder weapon, though the rifle mattered. It was speed, not the speed of a running man, the speed of an army updating itself. By the time a German field report about strange American movement had crawled up the chain of command, from the man with the scope to a battalion, from a battalion to an intelligence officer, from an officer into a memo, and from a memo up to the level where doctrine is actually written and changed, Patton's Third Army had moved another 200 miles east. The Americans were rewriting their playbook in weeks. The Germans could not answer in months. And that gap, that difference in the speed of learning, became as real and as decisive a fact of the war as any shortage of fuel or steel or aircraft. After it was all over, the German generals who had survived were sat down and asked to explain what had happened to them, and filtering out the natural human urge to blame Hitler, to blame the bombing, to blame the endless Allied material, one observation keeps surfacing in their words. In the spirit of those post-war interrogations, senior German staff officers, such as Gunther Blumentritt, who had served in the West, conceded in substance that by the summer of 1944, the American soldier on the ground had become something they had badly underestimated. He was speaking in the broad language of generals, but underneath his words was the exact thing the snipers had been reporting from the mud since June. The Americans had become, in the small and unglamorous business of infantry combat, very hard to kill, not impossible to kill. We must be honest, or we honor no one. The cost of Normandy was staggering. Tens of thousands of American families received the telegram that summer, the one that started with the words the War Department regrets. Difficult to kill is not the same thing as safe. Every lesson in those bulletins had been written in dead before it could be learned. The system worked, but the system was made of men, and the men were spent to build it. Which brings us back to one of them. Walter Ehlers, the sergeant from Kansas, the man who got all 12 of his boys off Omaha Beach. Remember that Saturday morning with a brother somewhere on that same terrible beach, Roland. His older brother. The two of them had grown up together on a Kansas farm, joined the army together back in 1940, fought together across North Africa and Sicily, side by side, the whole way. And before the invasion, the army had separated them on purpose so that a single shell could not take both sons from one mother. It did not work. Roland Ehlers went ashore at Omaha that same morning. A mortar shell struck his landing craft as the ramp went down, and it killed him, and it killed his entire squad in the surf before he had taken a single step onto France. And here is the detail that will stay with you the way it stayed with them. Walter did not know for more than a month ahead through all of it, through the beach and the hedgerows and the 9th and that June and everything he did there. Walter Ehlers fought on believing his brother was alive somewhere on that front. It was not until the 14th of July, more than a month after D-Day, that he ran into Roland's commander and learned the truth, that his brother had died on the sand on the very first morning. That while he had been keeping his own men moving, keeping them alive, the brother he had grown up beside was already gone. 5 months later, they gave Walter Ehlers the Medal of Honor. He wore it the rest of his long life. He lived to be 92 years old. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient who had landed in the D-Day invasion, and when he finally passed in 2014, a small piece of that generation went with him. And all his life, whenever anyone praised him for the medal, for what he had done in those hedgerows, he said the same kind of thing. He never bragged, not once. He would tell you quietly that he did not wear it for himself. He wore it, he said, for all the ones who did not come home. He meant the men in his squad. He meant the strangers in the surf. And he meant a farm boy from Kansas named Roland, his brother, who was killed on a beach on the 6th of June, and who never knew that the little brother he had gone to war beside would carry the memory of him for another 70 years. That is the thing the sniper in the hedgerow could never see through his scope. He saw 12 men who would not lie down. He saw a wall of fire that lied about its numbers. He saw a system, cold and fast and learning, and it frightened him, and he was right to be frightened. But he could not see what the system was made of. He could not see the farm boys inside those uniforms. He could not see the brothers. He did not see that every lesson those men learned, every reflex that kept them alive and moving where other men would have died in the dirt, had been paid for by someone else, someone who came before, someone whose is now a line on a stone in a quiet field in France. The Germans could not build that army fast enough to beat it, and they could not understand until it was far too late that the thing they were fighting was never really the rifle or the tactic or the strange refusal of those men to stop moving. It was a nation that had decided its mistakes were worth learning from, and its dead were worth remembering. They still are.